If you know the sine, cosine, or tangent ratio for an angle, you can use an inverse. Inverse sine, or sine to the -1 power, also known as arc sine. Cosine to the -1 power, also known as arc cosine, or tangent to the -1 power, also known as arc tangent, to find the measure of the angle. The table shows the relationship between the trigonometric ratios and their inverses. For example, if the sine of 30 degrees equals 1/2, then the inverse sine of 1/2 equals 30 degrees. If the cosine of 90 degrees equals 0, the inverse cosine of 0 equals 90 degrees. If the tangent of 45 degrees equals 1, the inverse tangent of 1 equals 45 degrees. So these are inverse operations, and we'll use them to do inverse operations and isolate variables. Like this. Problem 3. Using inverses. What is the measure of angle x to the nearest degree? Part A. Consider this triangle. It's a right triangle. We have a hypotenuse length of 10, and one leg looks like the shorter leg, by appearances, length of 6. You know the lengths of the hypotenuse and the side opposite angle x, so we'll use sine. Sine of x, notice now the angle is our unknown quantity. Sine of x equals 6/10. So the measure of angle x equals the inverse sine of 6/10. What we're doing here is we're applying the inverse sine to each side of the equation. We're undoing sine of x. But when we do that to the left-hand side of the equation, we also have to do it to the right-hand side. Now we have the measure of angle x all by itself, and that equals the inverse sine of 6/10. So we use a calculator to evaluate the inverse sine of 6/10, and we'll find that the measure of angle x is approximately 36.87, or 37. Part B, a new triangle. Some new information. In this case, you know the lengths of the hypotenuse and the side adjacent to x. So you use cosine. Cosine of x equals 15/20. So we apply the inverse cosine to each side of the equation. That isolates the measure of angle x, and it equals the cosine inverse, or inverse cosine, of 15/20. Using a calculator to evaluate, we find the measure of angle x is approximately 41.41, or 41. Your turn. Part A. Use the figure at the right. What is the measure of angle y to the nearest degree? And part B, a reasoning item. Suppose you know the lengths of all three sides of a right triangle. Does it matter which trigonometric ratio you use to find the measure of any of the three angles? Explain.